At 6:03 on the morning of March 18, 1944, Sergeant Caleb Rowan lay completely still beneath a collapsed wooden fence that had once outlined a vineyard now shattered by war. Frost coated the vine roots and crunched faintly beneath his breath. The fog had not lifted, and the Italian hillside town of Sant'Anna remained ghost-like in the haze. For 37 minutes, Rowan hadn't moved more than a blink or a breath. Every inch of his body was pressed into the frozen ground, his face resting against the stock of his Springfield 1903A4 rifle, a bolt-action, 5-shot precision weapon fitted with an 8-power scope. The steel was cold against his cheek, but familiar. It was the same rifle he had fired hundreds of times in North Africa, in Sicily, and back home before the war when he was a lumberjack who could split bark at 200 yards. His target was the old chapel tower 311 yards uphill, a Gothic stone spire half swallowed by the mist. Intelligence said the Germans had retreated from Sant'Anna weeks ago, but Allied scouts returning from the forward trail had said otherwise. Single shots, quiet ones, medics hit mid-rescue, messengers who never returned. And worst of all, riflemen shot through the neck center mass with terrifying accuracy. 12 men in 5 days. No warning, no reply fire, just one round, one kill, then silence. Colonel Dawes had called it phantom fire. Snipers who left no trace. Rowan had another word, hunters. These weren't just sharpshooters. These were forest-bred Jaegers, German snipers trained to stalk and disappear. He'd seen them before in the pine forests of the Vosges. Rowan was one of the few who had survived that. That's why he volunteered now. At 6:11, the fog began to shift like curtains parting on a stage. The light touched the chapel stone. Through his scope, Rowan caught a flutter, barely perceptible. A shape moved within the bell tower's dark lattice. He held his breath. Mist didn't shift like that. Wind didn't cause that kind of flicker. This was muscle, not breeze. He adjusted his scope. 2 clicks down. 1 click right. The elevation math was burned into his brain from Camp Claiborne's firing range. He slowed his breathing. The trigger on his Springfield broke at 3.2 pounds, smooth as glass. He had filed it himself, sanded it to perfection beneath oil lamps months ago in Naples, when he still believed in rest. Another flicker. This time, a glint, faint but sharp. Not glass, not moonlight. This was oil. Movement. A bolt being handled. That was no priest in the tower. That was a German sniper setting up his scope. Facing downhill, watching the south trail where American reinforcements would arrive. Rowan had found his man. He whispered nothing, said no prayer, no countdown. He exhaled halfway, held the breath, and squeezed. The Springfield cracked once, like a splitting log in an otherwise quiet forest. Through the scope, Rowan saw the shadow recoil violently. A head snapped back. Then the figure slumped sideways and vanished from the window's edge. He waited, counted. No reply. No motion. Just a final, hard fall. That was the first. But Rowan knew phantom fire never came from one gun alone. Rowan didn't move, not even to breathe deeply. His finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, and his cheek remained welded to the stock. He didn't work the bolt. Not yet. He began a slow, deliberate movement, the kind only a trained marksman understands. He curled his fingers in sequence, flexed his shoulders an inch at a time, and rolled slightly to his left, deeper into the soil and vine roots. Only when he was sure his rifle's muzzle was covered by the earth did he work the bolt. The empty casing popped free, but he caught it in his gloved palm before it could clink against stone. He pocketed the brass and slid in a new round, chambering it with smooth, practiced motion. No sound. No scene. His breath barely disturbed the frost on the grass. He resumed scanning, not the chapel, not anymore. That ground was burned. Any second sniper wouldn't be foolish enough to remain there. Instead, he turned his scope eastward, across the gentle slope where the vineyard met the rubble of what had once been a modest stone farmhouse. The roof was mostly collapsed, but a portion still remained. A triangle of brown-red tiles curling upward like a jagged wave. That's where the second shot would come from. He knew it. Elevation. Line of sight. Escape cover to the woods behind. It was the same setup he would have chosen. He watched. Nothing moved. Then, at 6:31, the tiles shifted. Just slightly. Not from wind. The air was still. Not from a rodent. Too heavy. Too deliberate. One tile angled upward, then lowered again. A hand? A scope? He couldn't tell. But that roof was watching the chapel, trying to spot who had killed the tower sniper. Rowan adjusted the scope 2 degrees left, settled the reticle where a head might rise, and waited. At 6:34, the faintest curve of a helmet appeared. Just the edge. Olive drab. German. Rising slowly, carefully, like a breath from beneath water. Rowan exhaled. Fired. The round cracked through the morning, and the tile exploded. The helmet vanished instantly, and a plume of dust rose as something heavy, a body, crumpled backward behind the ridge. No scream. Just silence. Second down. This time Rowan moved. He didn't leap up. He didn't run in panic. He crawled, slow and flat, using elbows and knees to slide beneath the lattice of broken vines and torn fence. He kept his rifle pointed forward, barrel low, boots tucked. Every motion calculated. Every shift of weight thought through. He had hunted whitetails in pine thickets back home, learned how to move without cracking snow crust. This wasn't different, just the stakes. He angled west, away from both shots, toward an irrigation trench he'd spotted during his map recon the night before. It was shallow and broken, half filled with mud and rotted leaves, but it had one advantage. It was lower than everything else. Snipers shoot downhill. They rarely check their feet. At 6:45, he slipped inside the trench, submerged in muck, rifle angled just above the lip. He didn't rest. He didn't eat. He didn't think about the shots he'd taken, because he knew what was next. The phantom fire wasn't over. It was hunting him now. The trench stank of iron and mold. Decades of harvest runoff had rotted the soil into black sludge, and Rowan's knees sank into it like it was swallowing him whole. He didn't flinch. He welcomed it. The muck was insulation, camouflage, protection. The smell covered sweat. The cold grounded his nerves. From his new vantage, he had partial coverage of the upper ridgeline, not the chapel anymore, and not the farmhouse. This trench carved a sightline just beneath the olive tree line, westward toward the slope known on the maps as Hill 92. It was a gradual incline, tree-heavy at the top, with layered rock outcroppings that gave perfect overwatch to the vineyard below. Rowan knew it was where the third would be. The Germans had built their doctrine from patience. That was the Jaeger way, 1 shooter per 100 meters, layered fire zones, never overlapping until a shot was fired. Created psychological panic. One bullet here, then silence, then one over there. You never knew how many were out there, and that uncertainty was deadlier than a firefight. Rowan had seen it work before in Tunisia, when a young corporal froze and got shot between the eyes trying to help a wounded man. That memory lived in the scar behind Rowan's ear, a fragment of his own helmet that had sliced him during the same encounter. So he didn't scan wildly. He didn't panic. He used the 8-power scope on his Springfield like it was a magnifying glass, not binoculars, slow, smooth, inch by inch. He ignored the ruined buildings and focused on signs of life. Not men, movement. Not figures, pattern breaks. At 7:13, something subtle shifted. A crow fluttered violently from a high pine near the midpoint of the ridge. Crows didn't lift without reason. Not this early. Not from high ground. Rowan adjusted, focused on the trunk. Nothing, but just beneath there, a branch twitch, a gloved hand, pushing aside low brush. It was brief, less than a second, but in sniper terms that was a lifetime. His reticle snapped into place just below the pine's lowest branch. He couldn't see the face, but he didn't need to. He saw movement. That was enough. The shot cracked, louder this time, sound rolling down the trench like thunder across sheet metal. The gloved hand disappeared. Then a shape, heavy, human, dropped back behind the trunk. Rowan kept his eye through the glass for 30 full seconds. No movement. No recovery. The bird didn't return. By 7:26, he had begun crawling again, this time toward the southeast slope of the vineyard, an area he had mapped mentally the night before when reviewing the terrain under starlight. A tangle of fruit trees marked the edge of the old orchard, twisted with rot and years of neglect. But beneath those gnarled limbs lay the remnants of a goat pen, collapsed wooden beams, rusted wire fencing, and dry earth that didn't echo footsteps. That's where Rowan went. It was a tight fit, but that made it better. Narrow sight lines meant limited detection. And from that position, if he adjusted slightly eastward and braced the Springfield on a fallen beam, he had a slanted view of the orchard's perimeter and the midslope where the German runners usually moved. In fact, it was a runner that gave him the next kill. At 7:49, movement shimmered briefly between two cypress trunks 280 yards away, a figure dashing low, not upright, using the cover of fog and terrain. No weapon visible. Just a canvas satchel and what looked like a field radio strapped to his side. He was moving fast. Too fast to be a forager. Too light to be infantry. Not shooting. Just relaying. A radio man. For a moment, Rowan hesitated. There was a strange moral calculus in shooting a man not holding a weapon, even in war. But Rowan had seen firsthand what these runners carried. Maps, grid coordinates, range cards, names, positions, orders. And every one of those items could mean death for men on his side. Killing a messenger wasn't an act of cruelty. It was survival. Rowan adjusted for wind. Lead the target just a breath. Held the crosshair at the shoulder seam of the tunic, the spot where the fabric tugs tightest when someone sprints. He exhaled, squeezed. The shot cracked. The figure staggered mid-stride. Legs folded beneath him. He collapsed forward into the dirt and didn't rise. Kill number 4. No celebration. No comment. No change in rhythm. Just one less voice calling down fire. Rowan stayed in position for another 14 minutes. Scanning. Watching. The fog thinned further as the sun climbed above the cypress ridge, but the haze at ground level still floated low like smoke from a dying campfire. The air had that quiet weight, the kind that only comes after an explosion or before another. He knew the Germans had heard the shot, but they were silent. This wasn't just sniping anymore. This was dueling. He wiped a streak of mud from his forehead with his sleeve and checked the map again. Not for enemy position, but for pattern, for kills, for different directions. Tower, north slope. Farmhouse roof, east. Pine trunk on hill 92, west. Runner, south edge. A full compass spread. They weren't just shooting from cover. They were rotating, setting fire zones from all sides, changing direction with every contact. Which meant there was a commander behind this, someone who understood American doctrine and knew how to unravel it. Someone who had studied how U.S. platoons responded to fire, how they flanked, how they panicked under pressure. This wasn't a ragged line of last-ditch shooters. This was a coordinated Overwatch net. And Rowan had just disrupted it, which meant they'd be hunting him now not just to kill, but to restore control. At 8:15, he moved again, angling east toward a stone wall near the edge of the vineyard. A crumbling barrier that once separated orchard from trail, now overrun by weeds and vine. It wasn't perfect cover, but it gave him elevation. And more importantly, it gave him overlapping fields of fire. He dropped behind the wall, readjusted the Springfield on the stone lip, and pulled out the aerial sketch given to him 2 nights ago. Thin lines, quick pencil work. But the features were real, the hill contours, the vineyard lines, the remnants of the old aqueduct where the Allies had planned to build a temporary supply line. He didn't just mark where he'd taken shots. He circled where he expected the next to come from. The Germans had used the tower as the eye, the rooftop for high ground sweep, the pine tree for shadow cover. The runner had been sent east to call in more. Only one spot remained unchallenged: the aqueduct ruins. He glassed it carefully. No movement. But then, something strange. A glint. Small. Faint. Not steel. Not helmet. Glass. A mirror. No soldier carried mirrors. Not unless they were signaling. Or baiting. Rowan narrowed his eyes. He recognized the move. Angle a mirror toward the sun and rotate just enough to reflect a flash, hoping the opposing sniper mistook it for scope glare and fired. Once he did, the Real sniper would trace the muzzle flash and return fire instantly. It was old-school Jaeger bait. Rowan refused to fall for it. Instead, he looked for the real clue, the one behind the glint. Tracks in the dew. They curved away from the aqueduct line and dipped south, toward a shallow wheat trench. And that's where he saw it, just barely. A muzzle, breaking the grass line. Not raised, not aiming, just waiting, hidden in plain sight. The sniper thought he had him. Rowan fired first. The figure dropped sideways into the wheat and disappeared. 5th kill. But Rowan didn't move, because the forest wasn't done. The forest never was. The sun was climbing now. At 8:15, Caleb Rowan shifted behind the collapsed stone wall that lined the eastern edge of the vineyard. The wall had once separated the grape rows from the footpath that led toward the aqueduct trail. A rough dirt strip now buried under churned-up mud and frozen moss. The wall was barely shoulder height in most places and crumbling from decades of disrepair, but it offered just enough cover to rest the Springfield's barrel on a stable surface. Rowan adjusted his weight onto his left elbow, using his right hand to angle the scope just slightly upward, toward the ridge that marked the orchard's outer boundary. The fog had nearly lifted. A low haze still hovered along the earth like a cautious ghost, but visibility was improving minute by minute. And with every inch of light came new risk. Rowan knew better than most. Sniping was a game of shadows. It was won not by who shot first, but by who blended longest. He reached for his canteen and found it empty. No water left. The cracker he'd eaten earlier was still lodged in his throat like sand. No food until sunset. Maybe. He checked the rifle again. 5 rounds in the well. No spare clips on his chest, only one left in his rucksack. He hadn't had time to retrieve the others after the mortar bracket. Every bullet mattered now. Every trigger squeeze had to be perfect. He pulled out the aerial map from his thigh pocket, the one hastily drawn by Lieutenant Marin the night before using charcoal and a piece of old linen. It was crude, but accurate. Chapel Tower on the north slope, the pine cluster on Hill 92 to the west, the ruined aqueduct trail cutting east through a broken ridge. Rowan marked his own locations mentally, tracing kill positions in his mind. The chapel, first shot. Farmhouse roof, second. Pine trunk, third. Radio man, fourth. Wheat line sniper, fifth. He circled them, each one at a different compass point. A full spread. A wheel of fire. The Germans hadn't just dug in, they had built a perimeter. A trap. A killbox designed to pin and drain any advancing Allied unit. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And Rowan had broken 5 of its spokes in less than 2 hours. But a wheel doesn't stop spinning unless every spoke is snapped. He returned to the scope. The stone wall was slick beneath his glove, cold with morning dew and stained with decades of dried moss. It made a fine shooting surface, more stable than dirt, but it also reflected light. He adjusted the angle, pressed a scrap of torn cloth beneath the rifle's fur end, dulling any glare. The wind was quiet, the kind of quiet that unnerves even the bravest soldiers. No insects, no rustling, not even birdsong. The orchard, once alive with bees and branches swaying in Italian spring, now sat like a frozen portrait, a landscape waiting for its final stroke. Then something blinked in the distance. Not movement, reflection, a glint, too precise to be coincidence, too controlled to be natural. Rowan froze. His scope found it again, high on the eastern ridge, near the ruins of the aqueduct. A small, square mirror, angled upward, catching the sun and redirecting it in a staccato blink. Rowan's first instinct was what any sniper feared most: bait. He had seen this tactic before in Tunisia, and once even practiced it during marksmanship trials in Sicily. A decoy flash, usually from a polished object, meant to draw a return shot. Once the American sniper fired, the real shooter would use the muzzle flash to zero in and countersnipe. Quick, clean, deadly. But Rowan didn't panic. He blinked slowly and allowed his breathing to slow. Then he scanned everything behind the mirror. Not the mirror itself, but the terrain surrounding it. The mistake most men made was to stare at the flash. Rowan stared at the trees beyond. First nothing, then tracks. Not footsteps exactly, but lines in the dew, as if someone had dragged their boots sideways while crouching. They led downward, curling into a low wheat trench that ran parallel to the broken aqueduct wall. Rowan smiled softly. Clever. The shooter was trying to distract him up top while hiding in the trench. He rotated the scope 11 degrees left, and saw it, the faint outline of a muzzle, barely peeking through the wheat, like a crocodile's eyes beneath swamp water. Not aiming, just watching, waiting. Rowan resisted the urge to fire immediately. He studied it. No wind, no sway in the grass. The muzzle didn't move. This wasn't nerves. This was discipline. He adjusted for range, estimated it at 247 yards. Set the reticle for center mass. Crosshair just below where a ribcage might sit if someone was lying prone. He took in a long, slow breath, let it out halfway, fired. The sound rang down the stone wall like a gong. The wheat trembled. A figure slumped sideways into the grass. Fifth sniper down. But Rowan didn't move. Not this time. He had stayed too long before. Given the Germans time to send a mortar crew. This time he waited only 10 seconds. Then he backed away from the stone wall. Belly crawled westward until he reached the dead side of a collapsed fruit shed. The shadows swallowed him whole. From there he watched. He waited 20 minutes.
No retaliation. No mortar.
No movement from the trees. But that didn't calm him. Because Rowan understood something deeper now. This wasn't about control of Santana anymore. It wasn't about terrain or trail movement or allied supply lines. This had become personal. He had taken out 5 of their best. The Phantoms knew who he was now. Not by name, but by silence. And silence, in a sniper's world, is signature. It meant they would be coming. And they wouldn't be carrying mirrors. They'd be carrying knives. By 9:02, the vineyard was flooded with sunlight. Not warmth, but clarity. The kind of hard light that made camouflage harder to trust and shadows feel like enemies. Every tree cast jagged silhouettes across the slope. Every patch of grass became a possible blind. The fog that had hugged the valley for hours had all but burned away. What remained was dry air, cracked silence, and open sky. Caleb Rowan shifted behind the ruins of a stone archway once part of a boundary fence. He had relocated 20 minutes earlier, crawling along the orchard's lowest embankment to avoid being skylined on the ridge. His ribs ached. The crack in his left boot sole let mud in with every step. His canteen was still dry. Hunger had started to press dull pressure behind his eyes. But he ignored it. Hunger couldn't kill you faster than a mistake. The enemy hadn't fired a shot since he dropped the wheatline sniper, which meant they were either resetting or hunting him back. Rowan's breathing stayed shallow. The archway wasn't perfect cover. The stones had collapsed in uneven heaps, some sharp enough to tear canvas, others crumbled into powder. But from this angle, he had a full line of sight across the southern treeline, including a narrow corridor between 2 walnut trees near the southern creek bed. He used the pause to clean the scope again. Lens cloth, 3 slow passes, no smudge. He checked the bolt, wiped dirt from the receiver, and ran a dry cloth through the action. No oil. He didn't want scent giving away his position. Even breath on metal could reflect sun glare under the wrong angle. He knew. He had learned that the hard way in Sicily when a fellow marksman had been spotted by shine on his scope and shot before he could blink. At 9:17 he saw it. Movement. Not a person. Not a weapon. A crow. It fluttered up, sharp and panicked, from the gnarled branches of a tree near the chapel ruins. Crows don't lie. They don't jump unless pushed. Rowan shifted the rifle, tilted the scope eastward, and tracked the air above the tree. Nothing visible. But then, something moved again, lower this time. The flash of black cloth. Not full, just an elbow dipping into cover. Someone had crawled past the base of the chapel slope. Rowan glassed the area methodically, and then he saw it, a helmet, just the crown, stationary, tucked beneath an angled bush growing along the slope's base. But something about it felt wrong. Too clean, too centered. Rowan narrowed his eyes. That wasn't a sniper. That was bait. He turned the scope south again. And that's when he saw the real problem. A glint of light. Not a mirror this time. Not intentional. It was from an eye. Just a faint reflection off the retina, buried deep behind the brush along a fallen ridge to the south. Whoever was watching him was already scoped in, and had been, for minutes. Rowan froze. Did the enemy spot his muzzle flash? Had his silhouette shown? Was his position compromised? He didn't move a muscle, didn't blink. Then, as if on cue, the sniper across the ridge shifted slightly. Not much, but enough to catch Sun off their scope mount. It was a mistake. A small one. But small was enough. Rowan fired. The shot cracked like a whip through dry pine. The dark figure jerked sideways, rifle tumbling from his hands. The echo rolled out across the ridge, scattering birds. Rowan didn't watch the body fall. He was already moving. Not sprinting, crawling. Fast. Low. Leftward. He rolled down a slope into a dry gully cut through the orchard by years of runoff. It was filled with dead leaves and broken shells. The scent of rot hung thick. He pressed himself into the gully wall, knees to his chest, rifle across his thighs. He reloaded. 5 down. 6 if the last shot was good. But something nagged at him. The glint from the eye, the position, the movement. That sniper had been too exposed, too careless. Not like the others. Was it inexperience? Or bait? His heart ticked faster than it had all morning. He glassed the ridgeline again. Then lower. Then right. And that's when he saw it. A second sniper. Crouched 90 yards east of where the last figure had fallen. Down in the shade, beneath a twisted pine. This one wasn't watching the orchard. He was watching Rowan. Or more accurately, watching where Rowan used to be. His scope was trained on the stone arch ruins. Rowan followed the barrel with his eyes. It hadn't moved. The sniper hadn't reacted. Which meant he didn't know the shot had come from a new position. Rowan's jaw clenched. He was ahead, for now. But only by seconds. He raised the rifle again, scoped the second shooter. At that range, 220 yards, it was a clean shot. He aligned the crosshairs to the collarbone. Exhaled. Fired. The man dropped before his body knew it was hit. Rowan kept his scope fixed, waiting for twitch or recoil. Nothing. 6 kills. Now the pattern had changed. The German snipers were no longer reacting. They were preempting. They were guessing where Rowan would go. Flanking his previous positions. Coordinating. Which meant one thing. He was no longer playing against individuals. He was being hunted by a unit. A cell. Rowan stayed in the gully, listening. He could hear something distant now, not gunfire. Voices. Low. German. Too far to make out words. At least 2. No shots fired. No panique. This wasn't retreat. It was approach. They weren't falling back from his fire. They were moving toward it. He rolled deeper into the shadows of the ditch, checking his pack. 1 clip. 5 rounds. He wasn't out of ammo. But he was running out of forest, running out of time, and he had a sickening feeling in his stomach that the real enemy hadn't even fired a shot yet. Not one, because whoever was leading these snipers wasn't on the ridge. He was in the trees, watching the watcher. By 9:40, Caleb Rowan had not moved for 12 minutes. Not a muscle, not a breath louder than the shifting of leaves around him. He was deep in a drainage ditch that ran between the orchard wall and the southern slope, his body soaked from lying in dew-soaked earth, and his nerves wound tight as a steel wire. The 2 most recent kills, one confirmed, one assumed, had come faster than any earlier. Too fast. And too easy. That was the part that disturbed him. The sniper he had just taken down near the pine was good. His discipline had been sharp. But his mistake had been tactical. He had aimed at where Rowan had been, not where he'd moved. That delay had cost him. Yet Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that it was intentional, that he'd been allowed to live long enough to see the shot present itself. Test, maybe, or a distraction. He wiped the sweat from his upper lip, slow, deliberate, checked the bolt, ejected the empty cartridge case into his palm. Brass was warm, barrel warm too, but not dangerously. Still accurate. He slid in a new round from his last stripper clip. 1 of 5. He now had 5 rounds chambered, and 5 left in total. 10 bullets. And no way to retrieve the others he'd left behind during the mortar run. He didn't regret the shots. Each one had bought safety or silence. But what he regretted now was how quickly the tempo had changed. This wasn't a manhunt anymore. This was a closing in. At 9:47, something finally broke the silence. Boots. Not far. Crunching twigs. The sound of careful steps. Not panicked. Not loud. But confident. As if the person making them believed they were not being watched. Rowan angled his head, cheek brushing against cold earth. Through a slit in the vine bank, he saw them. Leather boots, standard issue, blacked and worn, mud caked to the heels. Moving slow, controlled, maybe 30 yards away. Not rushing, not stomping. Patrolling. He lifted the rifle slowly, lifting only the barrel and scope above the ditch rim. 2 soldiers came into view. German. Not snipers, infantry. But they were moving exactly where his last kill had fallen. A recovery team. They were looking for the body. Rowan stayed low. Watched. Neither man was armed with scoped rifles. They carried MP-40 submachine guns slung low, barrels pointing at the ground. Casual. Dangerous in close quarters but useless beyond 50 yards. They weren't a threat unless they knew where to look. They reached the body. One knelt, tapped the shoulder. The sniper was dead. No movement. No return fire. The other cursed softly. Rowan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frustration. Not grief. Professional. Businesslike. They began checking his pack. Likely for map updates, coordinates, orders. Rowan wondered what they'd find. What kind of orders these snipers worked under. Were they a local Jaeger cell? Or were they something else, experimental? Deployed just to cripple American advances from the shadows? He would never know. Because the 2 soldiers finished their search and began to stand, when one of them froze. Eyes down.
Bootprints.
Not theirs. His. Rowan's own tracks from earlier. Leading away from the orchard wall, toward this very ditch. He cursed silently. He had been too focused on retreat. Hadn't thought about the path he left behind. The morning dew had made a perfect canvas. His boots had painted a trail like ink across parchment. The soldier raised a hand, said something. Both turned, scanning the terrain like wolves catching scent. They began to follow the prints. Straight toward him. Rowan stayed down. Waited. 25 yards. Then 20. At 15 yards, one of the soldiers reached for a flare. Red-handled. Short stick. Not a weapon, a signal. He was about to call in reinforcements. Rowan fired. The round punched through his chest before the flare left his hand. The stick tumbled sideways into the grass. The second soldier dove flat, but too late. Rowan worked the bolt, adjusted slightly, fired again. The second man's shoulder snapped back, and he crumpled sideways, arms folded beneath him. Silence again. But now, Rowan had 2 fewer rounds, and 2 more bodies on the ground. He didn't wait. He rolled backward out of the ditch, cut across the narrow trail, and dropped into the brush on the other side, deeper into the pines, where the shade was heavier and the sound was muffled by needles and mulch. He reloaded on the move, for shots fired. 6 left. His breath burned now. His ribs ached. He wasn't tired, not yet. But he was alone. And worse, he realized something. The infantry team had not carried radios. They weren't scouts. They were spot checkers. The real command was watching from somewhere else. That meant the patrol he'd just killed wasn't the threat. It was the prelude. He found shelter behind a massive fallen tree, its trunk split by lightning, the wood blackened and cracked like burned paper. He positioned the Springfield along the base, leveled the scope, and scanned the orchard line where the patrol had emerged. That's when he saw it. A figure, upright, calm, standing at the edge of the wheat field, not hiding, not ducking, watching him, black uniform, scoped rifle across his back, face unreadable in the sun. But the posture, the way he stood with his weight evenly distributed, eyes fixed like a falcon, It told Rowan everything. This was the one. Not a shooter. Not a scout. Commander. The architect of the trap. And he wasn't moving. He was waiting. Because he wanted Rowan to fire first. To reveal his last position. To give himself away. Rowan adjusted his scope, tracking the commander's heart. But he didn't squeeze. Because this shot wouldn't be easy. This shot had to count. Caleb Rowan kept his finger just outside the trigger guard. Not because he was afraid to shoot. Because he knew better. The man standing in the wheat field, tall, poised, rifle across his back, was not just bait. He was control. He wasn't there to shoot. Not yet. He was there to measure Rowan's timing. To calculate range. To provoke the one thing a sniper must never give away. Intent. Rowan had seen that posture before, once in Tunisia, and once in a training photograph from a German field manual they'd confiscated in Sicily. It was a sniper leader's pose. Not exposed, not casual, but inviting. A challenge cloaked in discipline. The man didn't flinch. Not when Rowan shifted his scope onto his chest. Not when the wind caught his sleeve. He simply waited, like a black chess piece daring white to make the first move. His weight leaned slightly forward, as though he was always about to take one step, but never did. Rowan adjusted the reticle. The range was too far for a sure kill under wind. Just over 400 yards, beyond the Springfield's optimal control without a sandbag rest or a bipod. And the wheat between them, high and rippling, created motion that made clean focus impossible for more than a second. He exhaled, deeply, slowly, then didn't fire. He rolled back behind the trunk of the fallen tree, pressing his back into the bark. He counted to 5, then 10, then 20. He listened.
No footfalls. No gunfire.
Just the creak of trees in the morning sun and the distant rattle of a bird wing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last intact strip of ammunition. 5 rounds of .30-06. He had 6 total in the weapon, but once these were gone, that was it.
No reload. No resupply.
The pack he'd ditched near the shell crater had the other clips. But it might as well be on the moon now. The orchard belonged to ghosts, and the ghosts had surrounded him. At 10:03 he began to move again, not toward the enemy, but around them. He dropped his profile low and slid along the natural incline of the terrain, using root breaks and shallow game trails to avoid crunching dry leaves. It was an old lumberjack's trick, how to walk through the woods without leaving a trail. One heel, then toe. Breathe only through the nose.
No sudden shifts.
Every 20 feet he stopped and listened. He was hunting the commander now, or being hunted. He didn't know which. At 10:12, he reached a copse of birch trees that curled along the edge of a dry streambed. From here, he had view back onto the wheat field, the exact location where the Phantom Commander had been standing. But now, the field was empty. Completely. Not just of men. Of evidence.
No vent stokes. No crushed wheat. No boat marks.
As if the figure had never been there at all. Rowan adjusted his position slowly, eyes behind the scope. He scanned the tree line beyond the wheat field, the left slope, then the right. Nothing, until the wind shifted, and the sun caught something metallic. Not a helmet, not a scope, a buckle, just above the eyebrow. A reflection, faint but real. Rowan rotated the Springfield left, glassed the area. His heart slowed. The reflection had vanished. Then it reappeared. Ahead, rising. 30 yards behind where the Phantom Commander had stood. It had been a trick, a staged position to draw fire. The real threat had been concealed behind. But Rowan hadn't taken the bait. And now he had his shot. The sniper stepped forward slightly, perhaps to adjust footing, perhaps to reposition for a countersnipe. Rowan squeezed. The shot cracked across the field. The figure jolted backward, body twisted at the hip, rifle flinging sideways out of his grasp as he collapsed behind the slope. Rowan waited 3 full seconds, then worked the bolt. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just inhaled, deep and clean, for the first time in an hour. Then, a new sound. Whistle. Sharp. Clear. A signal. Then another. From farther west. And then movement, multiple shapes, shadows in the trees, darting between trunks. 6, maybe 7. No rifle samd. But all eyes forward. Coming toward him. Rowan's blood turned cold. These weren't snipers. They were retrievers. And they were closing fast. He had 20 seconds, maybe 30. He checked the ridge. No cover. Checked the rear. Just the old trail down to the riverbed. That was it. He bolted, sprinting low, the Springfield in his right hand, angled across his chest. Trees blurred past him. Branches snapped across his face. Vines caught his boots. Behind him, boots. Voices. German. Urgent now. Closing. He dove down the river trail, skidded into a dry bend, and rolled into a pocket of shade beneath a flat rock shelf. Covered in pine needles, damp from a week of rain. He flattened his breathing, kept the rifle pointed backward. The pursuers reached the bend above. He could hear them. 2 stopped, whispered, then moved on, away. He'd evaded them, for now. But the pattern was clear. The shots weren't just about control anymore. This was psychological warfare. They were testing his limits, forcing movement, wearing down his judgment with pressure and silence, turning his rifle into a liability. Caleb Rowan was still alive, but he was no longer the hunter. He was now the prize. For 27 minutes, Caleb Rowan didn't move. Not a single inch. The underside of the rock shelf was damp and coarse, pressing into his shoulder blades like the rough palm of the mountain itself. He lay half-curled, elbow to ribcage, the Springfield cradled across his chest like a violin. Pine needles, wet and decomposing, layered beneath him. A single rivulet of water traced down the slope and pooled near his right boot. He didn't flinch as it soaked his sock. Above him, the ridge was still. The last pursuers had passed overhead more than 20 minutes ago, their boots crunching through pine and gravel, fading with every step. They hadn't seen him. That much was certain. Their formation had split, one pair moving toward the old goat pen, another sweeping west across the Aqueduct Trail. But Rowan knew better than to believe the danger was gone. What they couldn't see, they would circle. What they couldn't confirm, they would pressure. So he waited. He had learned patience in a way few men had. Not the patience of politeness or the restraint of manners, but the hunter's patience. The discipline to let hours pass while frost bit your bones, your bladder screamed, and your legs begged to twitch. He remembered once, back home, kneeling in a snow blind for 14 hours to line up one clean shot on a 14-point buck. His father had called it still blood, the ability to let time become meaningless in the presence of purpose. He had that now, but the difference was, this time he wasn't waiting for a deer. He was waiting for someone who had outlasted all the others. The 11th. The one who hadn't fired yet. The one who had designed the wheel. Rowan slowly lifted the scope and glassed the tree line to the northeast. Nothing moved. Then south. Then west. Stillness. He returned to the north slope, the chapel ruins now distant, blurred by rising heat distortion from the earth. No figures. No flutter of cloth. No shine-off metal. But still something felt off. Not in the trees. On the ground. He rotated the scope lower, brushing past undergrowth, brush piles, vine clusters, then paused. A ripple. At first, he thought it was a trick of light. But then, on the edge of his periphery, it moved again. Low. Controlled. Sliding more than crawling. A shape not standing. Not aiming. Creeping. It was the sniper. Not in the trees like the rest, but on the ground, weaving through brush like a serpent, moving toward the rock shelf. Not directly. Not yet. He was making an arc flanking the path Rowan had just escaped through. Rowan's breath caught. This one wasn't trying to find him randomly. He was tracking, stalking, and he was smart enough to come in from the opposite side. Rowan knew the danger instantly. If the sniper reached the northern ridge behind the shelf, he'd have elevation and angle. Rowan would be trapped against the slope, unable to pivot, with no line of fire. He had to move, but not yet. He watched the creeping figure for 2 full minutes. He was close now. 40 yards. Then 35. now crawling parallel to the base of the ridge, just below the treeline. Rowan slowly raised his rifle, adjusted the stock against the shelf stone, and aimed just over the ledge. He didn't have full visual, only the upper back, shoulder, and one side of the head. Too little for a clean kill. He needed a rise, a hesitation, anything that lifted the torso for just one moment. Then, as if fate whispered into the leaves, the sniper paused, lifted slightly, reached for something, a scope adjustment, a sightline recheck. Rowan fired. The .30-06 thundered out from beneath the rock, echoing off the slope like thunder cracking from a mountain heart. The figure spasmed violently, rolled sideways, then silence.
No shouting.
No counterfire, just stillness. Rowan kept the scope on the spot for 40 seconds. Then he reloaded, slow, methodical. 4 rounds left, 1 in the chamber. His hands were trembling now, not from fear, from realization. He'd seen that crawling pattern before. It wasn't random. It was his own. Copied. Mimicked. The final sniper, the 11th, had been watching him for days, tracking his style, learning his preferences, his timing, his angle of choice. This hadn't just been a sniper team. It had been a mirror. They hadn't hunted Americans. They had hunted him. Rowan exhaled hard, lungs burning. And that's when he heard it. A voice, soft, behind him, German, not barking orders, just talking, conversational. Rowan spun, rifle raised. Nothing. But now his ears caught it, multiple voices. Close, not aggressive, calm. Men approaching. From the west. Their footsteps were deliberate, purposeful, not charging, not rushing, as if they already knew the outcome. They were coming for the body, not to save, to retrieve, which meant the final sniper hadn't come alone. Rowan dropped low, slid backward beneath the shelf, pressed his back into the cold slope and held the rifle vertical, barrel up, finger off trigger. He was exposed. If they came just 3 steps closer, he'd be visible. His mind raced. He had 3 options. 1. Fight, for bullets left, 7 boots approaching. Slim odds. 2. Run, but no cover for 50 yards in any direction. 3. Wait and gamble on being passed over. He chose the 3rd. Still blood. The voices neared. He counted 6. Then 7. Then a stop. Silence. Then a soft sentence. 2 words. Then walking resumed. But away. They didn't see him. Rowan didn't move for 5 minutes. Then 10. Only at the 12th did he shift, turning slowly onto his belly, rifle back to position. The slope was empty. They had left. But he knew it wasn't mercy. It was calculation. The wheel was broken now. The last spoke had been cut. They had nothing left to protect. But Rowan understood what they left behind. Not a message. A memory. He wasn't their prey. He had been their rival. And now the forest was silent again. At 10:57, Caleb Rowan emerged from the trees. His steps were slow, precise, and deliberate, not out of ceremony, but necessity. His knees ached. His left shoulder throbbed from where he'd landed hard under the rock shelf, and there was dried blood beneath his right boot where a sharp pine branch had pierced through the sole. He didn't limp, not yet, but he moved like a man who had just walked away from something that could still reach for him in memory. The Springfield was slung across his chest, muzzle angled downward, safety on. The wooden stock was scraped raw from bark, and the barrel was dirt-caked, but the bolt still glided like silk. For live rounds remained. One casing was still warm in his pocket from the final shot. The sun was higher now, nearly straight above, casting hard shadows across the hills of Santana. No more fog, no more mist, just dry air and silence thick enough to make his ears ring. He crossed the final ridge near the southern trail, eyes scanning instinctively, though he knew no threat remained. They were gone. The phantoms had pulled back. Not defeated, just finished. There would be no more mirror games, no more flanks, no more whispers behind the brush. They had come to test him. They had lost, and they had left him behind with that truth. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A sentry behind sandbags raised his rifle half-heartedly before recognizing the shape coming down the trail. He lowered the weapon and shouted, "Incoming friendly!" toward the command tent. 2 more soldiers emerged, one of them a young lieutenant with a clipboard, the other a runner holding a field radio like it weighed more than his conscience. Rowan didn't speak. He simply nodded once and kept walking. By the time he reached Battalion HQ, Colonel Dawes was already stepping out of the tent flap, sleeves rolled, cigarette unlit between his fingers. His expression was unreadable, neither relief nor reprimand, just recognition. "You look like you crawled through a bad idea," Dawes said quietly. Rowan paused, then answered just as quietly, "I did." Dawes nodded, exhaled without lighting the cigarette. "How many?" Rowan unslung the rifle, leaned it gently against a water drum, and pulled out the stained linen map from his thigh pocket. He handed it over. 11, he said. Dawes raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Rowan nodded. "I watched the last one die." The colonel studied the map, the circles, the positions, the order, all clean, all annotated, all earned. He didn't ask for a body count confirmation. He didn't ask about witnesses. He simply said, "You'll need to write that down." Rowan replied, "Already did. In my head." The lieutenant with the clipboard stepped closer. "Command wants a full debrief," he said. Rowan turned toward him and said nothing. After a beat, the lieutenant added awkwardly, "You can clean up first." Rowan finally nodded. "That I'll take." They gave him a canvas cot behind the radio truck, a tin basin with 3 inches of water, a rag stiff with soap powder. He peeled off his gear, layer by layer, jacket, vest, shirt. The stink was unbelievable. Sweat, blood, bark, powder, mud. His hands trembled as he wiped the grime from his face. It wasn't fear. It was the release. The adrenaline was gone. And now the weight settled in, the kind no rifle could shoot through. He cleaned the Springfield last. Took him an hour. He used the edge of his sleeve to wipe the bolt, the scope mount, the trigger assembly. He cleaned each bullet left in his strip clip, rubbed the barrel